Madison had woken up that day feeling like she was about to experience yet another representation of what her family considered perfection. Her sister Sophia's marriage wasn't simply a wedding. It was a spectacle carefully engineered by her parents to reinforce the family's social image. As she got ready in her penthouse, she gazed out the windows overlooking the city and thought about what it had taken to get there. Endless nights of work, seemingly impossible mergers, contracts that had brought her international acclaim. That $2 million apartment wasn't just a piece of property, it was a symbol of everything she had achieved on her own. But deep down, she knew that in front of her family, none of it would hold any value. In her own house, she would always be the overly ambitious daughter, the one who never fit in. When she arrived at the ballroom, she immediately felt that everything was set up like a stage where she didn't play the lead role. The decor was dazzling. Flowers brought from Europe, jewel-like chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, cameras capturing every gesture of Sophia and the parents who were lavishing praise on the bride. The guests, more than 200, moved between impeccably dressed tables, rehearsed smiles, and comments laden with judgment. Some looked at her with respect, aware of her success, but others cast her those looks that were a mixture of envy and contempt. Sophia, for her part, seemed to walk on an invisible stage, collecting praise and affection as if she were the undisputed star of a play. For Madison, this contrast was nothing new, but the intensity with which this difference was portrayed gave her a strange feeling. Something was about to explode. The crucial moment came when, in the middle of the toasts, Richard and Carol took the microphone with broad smiles and announced something that left Madison speechless. In front of everyone, with cameras broadcasting live, they declared that as a wedding gift, their eldest daughter had decided to give her penthouse to Sophia and her new husband. The entire room erupted in applause. Guests rose from their chairs, some even recording with their phones, hoping to capture confirmation of this generous gesture. Madison felt the blood pounding in her temples. She hadn't been consulted, no one had asked her anything, and yet she was being used as the centerpiece of a public play. In a matter of seconds, what for others seemed like a moment of celebration turned into an ambush for her. She took a deep breath, tried to remain calm, and with a firm voice said no, that the apartment was hers, and she wasn't going to give it away. The ensuing silence was awkward, almost burdensome, until the loud comments began. Some relatives accused her of being selfish, others reminded her that she didn't have a family or children, that she didn't need so much space. The murmurings turned into direct pressure, as if everyone wanted to force her to rectify this moment. Madison felt that more than a marriage, she was in an improvised courtroom, being judged for not fulfilling the role of a docile daughter. It was then that Carol, her own mother, crossed the distance between them and, in a fit of rage, slapped her so hard it resonated throughout the living room. The cameras recorded everything. The scene was as violent as it was unexpected. No one dared to intervene immediately, although many lowered their gaze as if they were silent. Accomplices. Madison, her cheek burning and her heart racing, understood in that instant that the humiliation had reached an irreparable level. The blow was not only physical, it was the confirmation of years of contempt disguised as discipline and blatant favoritism toward Sophia. Some guests began to whisper, others recorded with their cell phones, and within minutes the slap was already circulating on social media. Madison felt a mixture of rage and wounded dignity, but also a strange relief. What had always remained hidden behind the doors of her house was now exposed to the entire world. It was in the midst of this awkward silence that the front door of the room opened and Marcus Chen, her boss and mentor, appeared, accompanied by 2 lawyers. His presence caused a general murmur, as few expected someone of his stature to appear at a family event like that. Marcus wasted no time. He asked for the microphone and clearly explained that the apartment was protected by a legal clause against any type of coercion. In a firm voice, he also revealed who Madison really was, the executive who had secured the company's most important contracts, a key player in its international expansion, and a strategic partner in several projects. As she spoke, she pointed directly at Richard and Carol, exposing how they were trying to manipulate and dispossess their own daughter in front of hundreds of people. The impact of Marcus's words was immediate. The murmurs turned into a thick silence, broken only by a few surprised gasps. The image Madison's parents had cultivated for years was beginning to crack in everyone's eyes. Richard tried to interrupt, but Marcus stopped him with a gesture of authority, reminding him that, as the owner of 40% of the family business, he had enough power to demand audits and reveal unethical practices he had seen firsthand. The entire room watched, torn between discomfort and fascination at seeing the official narrative crumble in a matter of minutes. Sophia, who until recently had been the center of attention, remained motionless, her smile frozen and her gaze lost. Madison remained silent, her back straight and her gaze steady, letting Marcus speak what she had so often kept silent. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to justify herself or soften the situation to protect her family. On the contrary, Marcus's every word was like a shield raised in her defense. Many guests began recording, aware that they were witnessing something that would soon be news. And indeed, that same night, videos of the slap and Marcus's intervention went viral, reaching millions of views. The Hayes family, which had always lived off a facade and social acclaim, found itself naked before the public eye, unable to control the narrative. The consequences were not long in coming. The next day, several important clients began cancelling contracts with Richard's company, arguing that they didn't want to be linked to such a public scandal. The Hayes reputation, carefully built over decades, crumbled in a matter of hours. Sophia, who had dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, faced an uncertain future. Her husband's family began to question the union, fearing that the proximity to such chaos would also affect their business. Madison observed everything with a calm she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she wasn't burdened by guilt or the weight of trying to maintain a facade. Everything was exposed, and although it hurt, it also meant liberation. It was at this point in the story that many who followed the case online rallied around Madison, highlighting her courage in publicly confronting her parents and refusing to be manipulated. And here I want to pause for a moment. If you're reading this far, tell us in the comments where you're following us from and share this story with your friends. Sometimes knowing where each voice is coming from helps us feel like we're not alone in experiences like this. That virtual support, multiplied by thousands of people she'd never met before, made Madison understand that her dignity could no longer be negotiated in the name of her family. The following days were a media storm. Television programs, news sites, and thousands of social media posts repeatedly rehashed the moment Carol publicly hit her own daughter. Analyses ranged from domestic violence to abuse of power in elite social circles. Sophia tried to maintain a facade, but her silence was interpreted as complicity, and soon her marriage fell apart. The groom's family broke off the engagement, stating that they did not want to be part of a union that began with scandals and lies. What was supposed to be a fairy tale became a symbol of family manipulation exposed to millions. Madison, on the other hand, received unexpected recognition. Marcus not only stood up for her that night, but within weeks he promoted her to senior VP and gave her a significant raise. That professional validation, coupled with social support, prompted her to make firm decisions in her personal life. She donated part of her bonus to a foundation that supported abused women, convinced that her story could be transformed into strength for others. She permanently cut contact with Richard, Carol, and Sophia, understanding that blood doesn't always define who deserves to be by your side. It was painful but liberating. For the first time, Madison lived by her own rules and not the expectations of others. The video continued to circulate for months, and although many remembered it as a scandal, for Madison it was a turning point. She was called for interviews, but she declined most of them, choosing to speak only in spaces where she could share a message of strength and dignity, not morbidity. People wanted to know how she had the courage to say no in front of 200 people and under the weight of social pressure. But for her, it wasn't a heroic act. It had simply been the last straw that broke the camel's back that had been accumulating contempt for years. That difference between how the world saw her and how she felt about it kept her grounded. Meanwhile, Richard and Carol faced social isolation. Longtime friends began avoiding them, invitations disappeared, and the family business fell into a seemingly irreversible crisis. Sophia, without the support of her failed marriage, ended up living with them, trapped in the same cycle of broken appearances. Madison, from her penthouse, watched everything from a distance. She didn't do so with vengeance, but with the coldness of someone who understood that you can't save someone who doesn't want to change. Instead of carrying the blame, she chose to look ahead, building a new circle of people who valued her for who she was, not for what she could give. In her new routine, Madison began to rediscover simple pleasures she hadn't allowed herself before. She went for early walks around the city, enjoyed the silence of her penthouse without, feeling empty, and dedicated time to personal projects she had put off for years. Every corner of her apartment reminded her of the effort she had invested, but now it also represented a refuge from the critical voices of her family. Despite the intensity of what she had experienced, she felt she had regained control of her own life. What had been used as a symbol of manipulation had transformed into the most intimate space of her independence. Over time, many people began to reach out to thank her. Women who were going through abusive family relationships, young people struggling with favoritism in their homes, even colleagues who had never dared to speak out about the pressure they'd endured. Madison understood that her story wasn't just hers, but a mirror for many. That unexpected connection gave meaning to the storm she'd endured. And right at this point, I want to extend an invitation. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments what part of the story most made you reflect, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes sharing isn't just a gesture, but an act of support for those who haven't yet found the strength to say enough. The following months confirmed that the decision to cut ties had been the most difficult, but also the most necessary. Madison received invitations to leadership conferences, not only for her professional success, but also for the personal story that inspired many. She spoke without embellishment, recounting what happened as it truly happened. A trap on a day that should have been a day of celebration, and the slap in the face that uncovered years of silent abuse. That honesty resonated deeper than any rehearsed speech. She didn't need to play the victim or exaggerate. Simply sharing what she had experienced was enough for others to understand the weight of silence and the courage of breaking it. Sophia, on the other hand, experienced a collapse of her public image. She tried to return to social media with superficial messages, but people's comments repeatedly reminded her of the favored sister who had participated in the ambush against Madison. Her marriage, now cancelled, became a constant reminder that happiness cannot be built on the ruins of manipulation. Richard and Carol, increasingly isolated, tried to keep up appearances, but the society that had once applauded them now pointed fingers at them with shame. The entire family had been scarred by a night they could never control. For Madison, the true triumph wasn't in the promotion or the headlines, but in the peace she began to feel every morning when she woke up. For the first time, she could drink coffee on her terrace without an inner voice chastising her for not being the daughter her parents had hoped for. She realized that she had always lived with the feeling of having to prove something, as if her worth depended on numbers or signed contracts. But that public slap in the face and the decision not to give in transformed that need into certainty. She no longer had to prove anything to anyone. She had earned the right to exist on her own terms. Still, there were painful moments. Cutting off her family didn't mean the memories disappeared overnight. There were nights when she struggled to sleep, reliving the scene of the beating, wondering if she could have done anything differently. However, instead of remaining trapped in those questions, she learned to see them as part of the healing process. She understood that overcoming is not a straight line, but a path marked by setbacks, advances, and setbacks. And every time the doubt returned, she remembered the cold ovation in the room and how she chose not to betray herself, even when everyone expected otherwise. Over time, her story became an example within the company. Colleagues who had previously seen her only as a demanding and competitive woman also began to recognize her personal strength. Marcus, always discreet, told her privately that what she had done that night was worth more than any signed contract because she had shown that integrity is not negotiable. That recognition, coming from someone she admired, healed old wounds. For the first time, Madison felt that someone in a position of power saw not only her talent, but also her humanity. At the same time, she decided to invest some of her time in mentoring young women seeking to make their way in the corporate world. She didn't want others to experience the same loneliness she had, felt for years, believing that success could only be achieved at the expense of everything else. She shared her mistakes, her fears, and also her lessons. That independence lies not in what you possess, but in what you choose not to allow. This work became a new source of satisfaction, deeper than any material achievement. She discovered that giving others a voice was a way to heal her own story. News about Richard and Carol continued to circulate. Every interview they refused became media. Speculation and every attempt to clean up their image backfired. Some media outlets leaked internal emails from the family business confirming questionable practices, and legal pressure began to mount. What had once been a respected empire was now in ruins, with mass layoffs and seemingly endless lawsuits. Madison, although aware of all this, decided not to get involved. It was a closed chapter. It was no longer her responsibility to save a legacy that had never included her. Sophia, unable to bear the public humiliation, tried to reinvent herself in different projects, but none prospered. People remembered her more for the scandal than for any new endeavor. Even among old acquaintances, her name was synonymous with favoritism and failure. Madison, on the other hand, continued to build a new life, focused on surrounding herself with people who added, not subtracted. She discovered genuine friendships in places she'd never looked before. People who weren't interested in her last name, or what she could offer them, but in who she truly was. This difference made her feel light, as if she had finally let go of a burden she'd carried since childhood. In her penthouse, which had so often been a source of conflict, Madison began to create a space that was all her own. She redecorated rooms, filling the walls with travel photographs and personal memories, without having to worry about whether they would be approved or criticized by anyone else. Every detail was a reminder that this place hadn't been gifted or inherited, but earned through hard work and resilience. She even invited close friends and trusted colleagues over, enjoying simple dinners filled with honest conversation, far from the superficiality of family events. It was like learning to inhabit her life from scratch. With each passing day, Madison confirmed that the decision to set a boundary had changed not only her present, but also her future. She was no longer afraid of being alone, because she understood that true loneliness wasn't found in living without family, but in being surrounded by those who never accepted her. The viralization of that painful episode became an unexpected platform that allowed her to inspire others and, at the same time, free herself from invisible chains. In the end, it wasn't the scandal that defined her, but the firmness of her no at a time when everyone expected her to remain silent. The biggest lesson Madison learned from all of that was that respect isn't something you beg for. It's something you demand through concrete actions. She had spent much of her life trying to earn a place in a family that never valued her, only to discover that all she achieved was to wear herself down. That night, in front of hundreds of people and millions more online, she understood that dignity begins when you stop compromising on the essentials. It wasn't about an apartment or money, but about her right to decide about her own life. And that clarity became her driving force for everything that came next. The support of strangers also played an unexpected role. Messages from women sharing their own stories of manipulation, men confessing to witnessing similar abuse in their homes, young people who saw her as an example of resilience. All of this poured into her email and social media, energizing her in moments of doubt. Madison understood that her experience, though painful, could have a purpose greater than herself. She had opened an uncomfortable, but necessary, door to a topic many prefer to keep quiet about. And in doing so, she was no longer just a successful executive, but a voice showing that you can always choose to say enough. As the months passed, Madison began to notice how her story was leaving a lasting impression. Universities and organizations invited her to speak, not so much for her corporate achievements, but for the way she had dealt with family pressure. She spoke without embellishment, without exaggeration, recounting, step by step, that day of Sophia's wedding and how a simple no had changed the course of everything. She didn't need to dramatize because the rawness of the events spoke for themselves. This generated a special connection with those who listened, who saw in her someone real, not a distant figure. Meanwhile, in her personal life, she began to rebuild relationships based on trust. She met new friends who showed her it was possible to share without feeling like she had to constantly defend herself. She even began to travel more, taking advantage of her freedom to explore places she had always put off due to work or family demands. Each experience outside the routine was a confirmation that life could be lived differently, without invisible chains or staged scenarios. It was like learning to breathe again, this time with her own air, not borrowed air. At the same time, Richard and Carol's family business finally collapsed. Lawsuits, debts, and the loss of clients piled up until it became unsustainable. The fall was so rapid that it surprised even those who had already given up on it. In social circles where they had once been admired, they were now spoken of as examples of arrogance and how abuse sooner or later takes its toll. Madison watched everything from a distance, without joy or sadness, simply certain that it wasn't her responsibility to pick up the pieces of a legacy that never belonged to her. She had learned to let go, and that act of detachment was her true victory. Sophia, unable to adapt to this new reality, went through a painful divorce a few months later and returned to her parents' home, mired in frustration. Her life, once marked by privilege and favoritism, became a routine of resentment and regret. However, Madison remained steadfast in her resolve to move forward. Every professional achievement, every genuine friendship, every step she took toward freedom confirmed that she had made the right choice. It wasn't about triumphing over her family, but rather triumphing over the limits they had imposed on her for years. And in that contrast, the difference between surviving at the expense of others and living with her own dignity was evident. Madison also decided to share part of her experience in a book about her experiences. It wasn't a corporate biography or a leadership manual, but a candid account of how emotional abuse within the family can disguise itself as love and tradition. In writing, she relived many painful moments, but she also discovered strength she didn't know she had. The book became a tool for personal healing and, at the same time, a beacon for those who felt trapped in similar dynamics. She wasn't seeking revenge or exposure, but rather to show that saying no is an act of survival and self-respect. That project connected her with supportive communities and people she would never have met in her previous world. Women leaving toxic relationships, young men seeking independence, men beginning to question the familial burdens they'd normalized. Madison found in those interactions something she'd always lacked at home, a sense of belonging. She didn't have to pretend or play a role. She could simply be herself, with her scars and her determination. And that feeling, more than any promotion or public recognition, was what ultimately gave her peace. Over time, she learned to see that day not just as a wound, but as the gateway to a different life. The moment her mother raised her hand in front of 200 people had been devastating, but it had also been the spark that ignited her freedom. Madison understood that change often comes wrapped in pain, and that what matters is what you decide to do with that pain. She chose to transform it into a driving force, an example, and a new way of relating to herself. That clarity allowed her to stop asking herself, "Why me?" and start asking herself, "What do I do with this now?" The answer was right in front of her every time she opened the door to her penthouse and saw the city spread out beneath her feet. That place they tried to take away from her became the symbol of her rebirth. It wasn't just brick, glass, and luxury. It was proof that she had endured and that she had chosen not to give up. Every sunrise in that apartment was a silent reminder that dignity is not negotiable. And although the scars still remained, Madison knew she was no longer the woman who had walked unsteadily into that wedding, but someone who had learned to stand up even when everything seemed to be falling apart. The outcome of all that left a clear lesson for those who followed her case closely, that family isn't always synonymous with support, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is setting a definitive boundary. Madison understood this at a high but necessary cost. By cutting ties, she not only freed herself from a toxic dynamic, but also made room for new people, experiences, and projects that truly added value. She discovered that she wasn't the difficult daughter nor the overly ambitious woman, but someone strong enough to refuse to be dragged into a destiny that wasn't hers. That conviction would always stay with her. Today, Madison moves forward with the life she chose. Her parents and sister were trapped in the consequences of their own actions, while she walks with her head held high, aware that respect and dignity are never given away. They are defended. Her story, told thousands of times online, inspires others to find the courage to say enough. And if you've read this far, remember to share this story so it reaches more people who need it. Perhaps someone somewhere is waiting for that sign to take the first step toward freedom.